You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to episode 4 of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about my libertarian conversion. And so the basic idea behind the show today is that I have been saying ever since I became politically and socially aware, it's only been about 6 or 7 years now, but ever since I became really politically aware that I might be a part of this libertarian movement, I've always said that the reason why I am a libertarian is because I was a Protestant first, because I was a Christian first. And so I really became a libertarian and committed to libertarian ideas long before I knew anything about society or politics. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. So this is going to be autobiographical. I'm going to share a little bit of my life story with you guys today, just to kind of give you a perspective on how I, as a Christian, came to become a libertarian. And I hope that those of you guys that are here for the Protestant part of this podcast can get something from that, especially if you're on the fence about whether or not libertarianism is right for you. I want to try to explain how I feel like this was the most natural conclusion that I could have come to as a Christian. So I grew up in a lot of different churches. When I was born, I was baptized in the Catholic Church. My family went to the Catholic Church for a while, and then just had some issues with the local church there. My mom wanted to explore something different, so we went to a Methodist church for a couple of years because she had grown up in the Methodist church. And then we wound up by a series of circumstances going to the Lutheran church down the road from our house, and we started going there when I was in about 7th grade, Hebron Lutheran Church in Hebron, Kentucky, and that was where I spent most of my formative years and where I got my first job in ministry. So Hebron Lutheran Church, very important part of my life. One of the things that you do in the Lutheran Church is when you're in middle school and I guess a freshman in high school, you go through a 3-year confirmation process where you take classes once a week during the school year to teach you about the Christian faith and about Lutheranism in particular. That's where I learned to fall in love with Martin Luther. I got my first exposure to him in those classes, and it's one of the reasons why I still consider myself to be an ideological Lutheran, as we discussed on last week's show, or maybe it was the week before last. But you have to go through confirmation in middle school and early on in high school. And, like a lot of kids, I really struggled during middle school. I was very awkward, very angry at the world. Puberty did me zero favors. I was unhealthy and not happy about anything. But I went through confirmation, and I had this, in the last year of confirmation, you're paired up with a mentor. So someone who has been in the church for a long time that kind of knows their way around the faith. And you do a couple of, do a couple of things with them. You go to different churches, and they'll meet with you just to talk about various issues relating to faith. And I got paired up with a man named Jim, who, was at that time probably the most informed and well-read guy at our church, and just an incredible guy. And I was extremely fortunate to have Jim as my mentor that year. And one of the things that he challenged me to do was to sit down and read the Gospels. And I had never really read the Bible for myself before. And I didn't really know what to expect, but Jim really encouraged me to do that. And I remember I was a freshman in high school, 14 years old, and I remember just picking up the Bible and reading all 4 of the Gospels straight through in a week. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 of them. And it was terrifying. I had absolutely no idea what was going on there. And you got to remember, this is the early 2000s. So this is the era of the Left Behind series and spiritual warfare. Demons are behind every door wanting to stab you in the neck if you sin against God. It was really, really scary. And one of the things that came to me through my reading of the Gospels for the first time was the fact that if I was going to follow Jesus, it was going to be really, really hard. And so I wound up actually making the decision to not get confirmed because I was so concerned that there was no way that I was going to be able to really, truly follow Jesus. And at that time in my life, I just didn't want to do that. Well, fast forward a couple months, I had some pretty powerful experiences happen in my life, and I wound up becoming a Christian. I wound up deciding that I would always have considered myself to be a Christian, but I wound up actually dedicating my life to Christ. And after that, I realized, because I think of the influence of Jim and then just growing up in a Lutheran church where we didn't read the Bible in the way that I would necessarily want to have had it read now. But I grew up in a church where we talked about Martin Luther and we talked about the importance of Scripture. And so I knew that if I was going to take my faith seriously, I was going to have to read the Bible. And so I remember that like when my sophomore year of high school, 14 years old, going through, or 15 years old, I guess at this time, going through the New Testament for the first time, I just remember being just completely overwhelmed by what I read in there. And I have a very powerful experience that I'll talk about someday of the first time I ever met, or the first time I ever read Paul. Is great. But I just remember reading through the New Testament, and then in high school, I just read through the New Testament over and over and over again. I'd occasionally dip in and out of the Old Testament, but I just read the New Testament nonstop, and I tried to figure out what it all meant, like what was going on there. And I was really challenged by Paul and by Jesus and the Gospels in particular. One of the things that I knew that I had to do was live out my faith, that if I was going to be a Christian, that I actually had to like put into practice the things that I believed, and that put me in a lot of really uncomfortable positions. And I also had the responsibility of sharing the gospel with other people. But there were several passages that really kind of informed the way that I thought about that. Like I learned on my first reading of the Bible that I was not going to be able to force my beliefs on anyone that did not want to follow them. Now, I felt like I needed to tell absolutely everybody about my faith. I was really intense about that in high school. And so if you are listening to this and you remember me from high school, I apologize for how crazy I was with all of that stuff back then. I'm a lot more relaxed about it all now. But I knew that I had to share my faith, and I knew I had to live out my faith. But there were a couple of passages that taught me that no matter how much faith sharing I did, there were always going to be people that were not going to accept it. Now, I want to look at just like two of those passages right now. The first one that hit me, because Matthew was the very first book of the Bible that I ever read all the way through from start to finish. Jesus has a parable in Matthew 13 where he's talking about the growth of the kingdom of God. And he says this here. I got my Bible in front of me, and I'm trying to figure out exactly where this is. Oh, here we go. So it's Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 24. And it says, Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both of them to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First burn up the tares and bind them into bundles and burn them up, but gather the wheat into the barn. And Jesus will go on to explain this later on. And essentially what this parable means is that there are always going to be people that will accept the message of the kingdom of God, that will accept the gospel, and there will be people that just won't. And we have to live as Christians with the reality that there will always be people that do not accept what we believe. And we just have to live with that. Like, not everyone is going to submit to the gospel, and that's just a part of life. That's just a part of being in the real world. The other passage that really had a profound impact on the way that I kind of looked at my responsibility as a Christian and evangelism and everything is from 1 Corinthians. It's the Apostle Paul, if you're not familiar with the New Testament here. And it's 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 13. And here's what Paul says there. He says, I wrote to you, the Corinthians, in my letter, I guess a previous letter that Paul had written to them before 1 Corinthians, not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reveler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. And this is the big one right here. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the church, but those who are on the outside God judges? And then he quotes Deuteronomy 13, remove the wicked man from among yourselves. And the whole point here is that, yeah, as Christians, we need to be concerned about what's going on inside of the church. I've kind of alluded to this before on this show, but we can't really control what happens to people that are not a part of the church. direction as Christians. We should be more focused on what's happening within the church instead of trying to focus on, forcing people to embrace our worldview or to accept our values that are not a part of the church. There are a couple of other passages that were really important to me. Obviously, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he very famously says in Matthew chapter 5 that we are like, the church is like the people of God are like a city on a hill or a lamp on a stand, and we need to let our light shine before men so that they will see our good works and glorify God. And then he throughout Paul, it is the gospel. Again, this is the foundation of the Protestant Reformation, Romans 1:16 through 17, where Paul says that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to all who have faith. So it's not me going out there and forcing other people to believe in the gospel or to live by the values that I think Christians ought to have. It is the work of God through the Holy Spirit. My responsibility is to be a light to the world, to both live out my faith and to share my faith with other people without forcing them to embrace my values and my beliefs. And we're going to spend a lot of time on future episodes talking about the Middle Ages because that's what I teach, and historically that's kind of the time period that I'm the most interested in right now. But if you look at like the medieval Catholic Church, just at a glance there are a lot of people that were, basically everyone in Europe at that time was a part of the Catholic Church, but most of those people didn't have faith. And that's one of those things that when you try to force somebody to be a part of a system that they don't understand or they don't accept, that faith cannot be true. It cannot be legitimate. It cannot be transformative. And that was kind of the philosophy that I applied to my ministry, and really that's kind of been my overriding guiding principle as a Christian ever since then, that I have a responsibility to live out my faith and to share the gospel with as many people as possible, but it's not my responsibility to force them to believe. That is the work of God through the Holy Spirit when people have a real encounter with the gospel, with the crucified and risen Jesus. And I believe that to my core. And so when I was growing up, that was just kind of like my attitude from high school on. I've just felt like I don't have a right to force my faith on other people. I need to share it, but I can't force them to believe anything. And that is a principle that I kind of slowly over time began to apply to politics. And like most kids growing up, I think my first, at least growing up in the 90s, I remember my mom had me actually watch, and I don't remember when it was 98 or 99, I guess, but I remember that I watched a part of the Clinton trials. I remember seeing that on TV when President Bill Clinton was impeached for his scandal with Monica Lewinsky, to put it lightly. And that was kind of the first experience that I ever had of politics. And then obviously I was in 7th grade when 9/11 happened. And I'm from Kentucky, and so after 9/11, everyone in America was pretty much unified, and everyone was out for blood. And, I remember being in 7th grade and listening to Toby Keith and thinking that, we wanted to go out there and kill Al-Qaeda and win one for the boys back home and all of that kind of stuff. And so in high school, I guess, considered myself to be more of like a Republican. I didn't really know what those terms meant back then. I knew that Republicans were kind of like, pro-war. They were tough, not politically correct. And I knew that the Democrats were like the opposite of that, I guess. But I didn't really have any sort of clear political philosophy. And at that time, like I kind of believed, and I still, I guess, hold this belief. I was like, I'm really more concerned about the gospel, and that seems a lot more important than all this political stuff. And I still stand on that. Like I'm still 100% committed to that. Like as Christians, what matters is sharing the gospel, and the politics, it's kind of like a sideshow. And that was my approach throughout college, or throughout high school rather. And when I turned 18 in 2007, and then the next year, 2008, I got to vote in my first election. And just being from Kentucky, kind of being a, pro-military sort of guy and everything like that, I voted for John McCain. And 2008, John McCain and Sarah Palin, I'm going to say it on record here, I voted for John McCain, and I only knew that he was running against Barack Obama, and that based on, being someone who lived in Kentucky, I thought that John McCain was going to be my guy. I didn't really know much about the policies at the time. But I also remember, too, that there was a local tax hike that wanted to be, I lived in Boone County, Kentucky at the time, and they were going to raise taxes to, I guess, give extra money to the parks department or the park system in the county. And I remember being against that because in 2008, I thought, we were going through this recession. And again, I didn't understand the economics of any of this. But I realized that, maybe raising taxes when a lot of families were struggling to make ends meet was not a good idea. And so I remember voting for John McCain, but I also voted against this local tax hike. in my community. And so and that was where I started thinking about these issues. And then that same year, is like my freshman year of, or I guess my sophomore year, it would have been, of college, I got a subscription to Time magazine because I wanted to learn more about politics. And I thought that if you were a responsible adult, you needed to have a subscription to some magazine. And I didn't know anything about like political bias or anything at the time. I just knew that Time magazine, I saw it whenever I went to the grocery store, and it seemed like a reputable magazine at the time. It is almost comical to say that, 14 years later. But Time magazine seemed reputable. I started reading it, and of course had no idea what any of it meant, especially the economic sections. There were some columns that I learned a lot from in Time magazine. I do have to say that. And in 2008, I think they were a lot more balanced than they are now. And as I read it too, there was a while there where I had associated myself with conservatism, but like I was reading it, and I was reading about some of the things that the Obama administration was doing, or at least saying that they wanted to do. And when it came to things like gay marriage or pot legalization, I was like, I really don't think, like, as a Christian, I have my own values, I have my own views on both of those issues, but like, if someone's not a Christian, why should I care if they want to marry someone who is of the same sex as them, and why should I care if somebody wants to smoke pot? Like, it's really none of my business. Like, and I just believe that it was my responsibility as a Christian to show love to all of those people. So like, I just didn't feel like that the government should be involved in like prohibiting people from doing things that they didn't want to do. And so I thought that for a while there in college that I might be a liberal, because I just kind of associated the Democrats with being anti-authoritarian and with wanting people to make their own free decisions. And so I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know anything at the time. I read Time magazine, every single issue, every single week, but not having, my background was in biblical studies, so I didn't know a lot about political philosophy or economics or anything like that. And at the same time, I was getting into anti-imperial studies in the New Testament. So I was going through my bachelor's degree program, and it was in the early 2000s in New Testament scholarship, there was kind of this big turn towards anti-imperial studies. So people that were deliberately reading the Old and New Testament, scholars that were deliberately reading the Old and New Testament, trying to see if there was anything in there that was anti-imperial. And so I was reading people like Michael Gorman, who has, as we said on last week's show, Michael Gorman has some really great anti-imperial work. I think his economic stuff is a complete mess, but his views on empire are really good. I was reading a lot of N.T. Wright, who is a very famous scholar and theologian that we'll talk a lot more about on this show, believe me, because he's probably the world's most famous biblical scholar of all time, maybe outside of Luther and Calvin and some of the other reformers, and then Richard Horsley and other people like that. And one of the emphases that these anti-imperial scholars bring out in the New Testament is that we call Jesus Christ, and the term Christ means Messiah, which is the King. And so one of the consequences of reading the New Testament, and we'll probably talk about this more on a future show, is that if Jesus is the Messiah, if Jesus is truly the Messiah, then he must be the King of the world, and I should not be, at least what I got from these studies, is that I should be committed to Jesus and not to any particular political movement. What I didn't realize at the time, but I do now, is that a lot of these scholars, and I love them dearly, like Gorman and Wright and Horsley have all had a profound influence on my thinking about the Bible. They would all kind of suggest that maybe we should give more economic power and things over to the government, as we talked about that on last week's show. So I kind of had this sense that I didn't like government. I got that from the anti-imperial study stuff. Unfortunately, I was not able to perceive what they were suggesting about economics and things like that at the time. I realized I didn't like big government. Like, I didn't like imperialism, whatever that meant to me at the time. I didn't like forcing my values on other people, and I didn't really like the government spending a lot of money. But I had no idea where I was on the political spectrum. In 2012, I was kind of over it. So the Romney-Obama election, at that point in my life, I was in ministry, and I just kind of felt that, like, I wasn't even sure if Christians should vote at that time. I was so bent on, yes, I wanted to understand what was going on in the world, but the only thing that mattered was the gospel, and this political stuff did not matter. So I skipped the 2012 election. I decided that I wasn't going to vote on principle. I didn't like Romney. I didn't like Obama, and I didn't know that there were any other alternatives. So I was just going to skip it. And at that time, I wasn't really aware of what was going on at the state level. So I completely skipped the 2012 election. And that was kind of my default position for a couple of years. And then in 2015 and I realized that I wasn't going to be doing ministry for the rest of my life, and I decided that I was going to become a teacher. And so I enrolled at Northern Kentucky University because it was just a couple minutes from my house, and they had a master's program that was going to be 2 years long, mostly online, and I could get my master's degree in education and become a teacher in just 2 years. But before I could join that program, I had to take about a year of prerequisite classes that I didn't take when I was in my biblical studies program. And it couldn't have been more perfect. I started school in the fall of 2016. My prerequisite course is to go to college. And I took an economics course and a political science course. And so I'm a very diligent person when it comes to studying. When I want to learn something, like I want to know whatever it is inside and out. And so I knew, at the end of 2015, going into 2016, that I was going to have to take those classes. And so I began listening to trying to find some good podcasts because I drove a lot for work at that time, and so I wanted to find some good podcasts that would help me learn about that. And so I started listening to the Hoover Institution, which is actually kind of a conservative think tank out of Stanford University in California. I started listening to the Hoover Institution's podcast, and they had a couple, Victor Davis Hanson, who's a fairly middle-of-the-road conservative commentator. He's a classicist, a historian, so even though now I don't agree with him, I do like a lot of his insights because he tries to approach politics from the perspective of the classics. And then there was one called The Libertarian by a guy named Richard Epstein, and he is an economist, I think a Chicago school economist, and I started listening to that podcast. And then Peter Robbins is the guy's name, has a show called Uncommon Knowledge, and he would have all kinds of thinkers on there. But I remember he would have as a regular guest a man named Thomas Sowell. And so all throughout 2016, I started listening to Richard Epstein's take on economics and kind of thinking about that. And then, man, every single time that Thomas Sowell was on Uncommon Knowledge, that dude is unbelievable. And I just remember, I go on, runs, and I was driving for work, and I would just listen to those episodes that Thomas Sowell was on over and over and over again because every single word that comes out of that guy's mouth is just so good. Like, Thomas Sowell's perspective on society and economics is rigorous, based on statistics, but I listened to a lot of that. And at that time, I was kind of thinking, okay, so this Epstein guy calls himself a libertarian. I have known people that had called themselves libertarian. I was like, man, I agree with a lot of what he says, and Thomas Sowell is connected to him through the Hoover Institution, and so, I agree with what a lot of Thomas Sowell says, so maybe I'm a libertarian. So I started taking this economics course and this political science course at the same time, and man, this economics course just absolutely changed my life. And it was the basic, I read out of it last week on the show, Irving Tucker, I think is the guy's name. It's like a survey of economics, the 8th volume. It's a basic economics textbook, but learning about scarcity and choice and supply and demand, all of those issues, I had never even thought of economics that way before. I knew as a Christian that I had to be generous, and so there was a part of me that was like, well, maybe, we kind of should support a welfare state, I guess. If we're supposed to be generous, then what does it matter if the federal government takes a little bit more of my money and gives it to people that are poor? That sounds like a good thing. But reading this economics textbooks, and it's not a conservative or libertarian or Austrian textbook, it's just a middle-of-the-road basic college textbook, but just learning about these basic economic principles, actually having capitalism and socialism defined to me, it was a game changer. But then the biggest moment for me in 2016, and some of you guys are going to laugh at this, but I didn't like Trump or Clinton, obviously. I wasn't going to vote for either of the two of them. I mean, I think Trump has some good instincts. I think Clinton is just a corrupt politician. But I wasn't going to vote for either of them. And one day, I remember coming home from work, and I was working at a dry cleaner at the time, so very sweaty, hot, no air conditioning in there. And I was going to take my wife out on a nice dinner, and I just so I wanted to come home and get a shower before we went out. And I remember on the way home thinking about the election. I'm like, man, I wish that there were other alternatives. And I knew that there was a Libertarian Party, and I knew that there was a Green Party, and I was like, well, maybe I should look into those. And so I remember getting on my iPad when I got home, and just getting on YouTube and searching searching for like libertarian candidate or something like that, and I came across this town hall it was actually CNN. I think Anderson Cooper was the one that hosted it, and he had Gary Johnson and Bill Weld on, who were running for the Libertarian Party committee, or the Libertarian Party for president in 2016. And so as I was taking a shower, I turned on the town hall that Anderson Cooper did with Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. And I know a lot of people in the Libertarian Party and in the Libertarian movement think that Gary Johnson is a clown. They think that he's a goofy guy, and he is kind of a goofy guy. But I remember listening to him while I was taking a shower, and every single thing that he said about not wanting to criminalize drugs, about needing to scale back the reach of the military, about free market economics, like everything that Gary Johnson said, even though he is kind of a goofy guy, I resonated with all of it. Like I realized like that is who I am. So it was in the late summer, early fall of 2016, in the shower, I realized that I was a libertarian. And it was through Gary Johnson being interviewed by Anderson Cooper on CNN. I know it sounds ridiculous, and to my libertarian friends that are like, man, this guy's crazy. Yeah, I get it. Gary Johnson was not a perfect candidate, but he was way better than Trump or Clinton, obviously. And so that was what changed my life, listening to Gary Johnson talk about politics, and I realized that was where I was coming from. And it wasn't long after that I started reading Reason magazine on a regular basis, and because I didn't know much about the libertarian world at that time outside of Reason, and Reason is great, but it does represent kind of only one spectrum of libertarian thought. I also started listening to Ben Shapiro a lot, and yes, Ben Shapiro is a conservative, and even when I started listening to Shapiro, I knew that there were things that I did not agree with Shapiro on. But one of the things I do appreciate about him, and I think more libertarians maybe need to be open to finding people within other political philosophies or traditions that have good ideas. At least Ben Shapiro is consistent. Like one of the things I respected about him is he did not change at any time his principles as a conservative to try to back Trump up. And he's just as critical as Trump as he was as supportive of him. And really, I think Shapiro's got a lot of great libertarian impulses, and I hope that someday he'll realize that deep down inside he probably is one. That would be great. Now, over time, I don't really listen to Shapiro much anymore. But it was really helpful at that time just to kind of form some of these ideas. And, obviously his thoughts on economics were very important as well. And so over the next several years, I was reading Reason magazine, listening to Shapiro, still listening to the Hoover Institution. But over time, I kind of became more and more aware that like I was becoming more of a libertarian, that as these principles of economics and as these principles of kind of social thought seeped in, and they combined with my belief that the gospel was the only thing that really mattered, and that politics is kind of a sideshow, I realized that like I wasn't where Reason magazine it generally is, and I definitely wasn't where Ben Shapiro was as a libertarian. And then in 2020, so we're not talking about very long ago, I read two more books that completely changed the way that I understood the world. And one, Economic Facts and Fallacies by Thomas Sowell, just an absolutely fantastic book. I think that was one of the first books I read when I was in COVID lockdown. And Thomas Sowell, I mean, it's 200 pages, just absolutely demolishes every conventional idea about economics that both the Republicans and the Democrats generally hold. It is unbelievably well researched, and Thomas Sowell is such an articulate and simple writer. He's just so clear in what he says. He just lays it all out there. But Economic Facts and Fallacies really turned me kind of down that more anarcho-capitalist Austrian approach to economics. I didn't know what that was in early 2020, but he was the one that took me down that road. And then finally, at the very end of 2020, I guess fall of 2020, F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Man, Friedrich Hayek, that book talking about the dangers of central planning and about big government control, it is truly a classic within the libertarian movement. And The Road to Serfdom made me realize that, like, because at that time I was still like, well, maybe the government should regulate some aspects of the economy, and maybe we should have kind of a little welfare state. But F.A. Hayek's arguments throughout The Road to Serfdom just convinced me that when people get political power, they're never going to be trusted to use it in a responsible sort of way, and that pushed me even further and further down the road. But at this point, it's the end of 2020, and I'm reading Reason, and I realize I'm a little bit more radical than them. I still love Reasons. I still do. I'm a subscriber to Reason magazine. I still love it, but I'm a little more radical than that now. And at that point, I was just kind of like not over Shapiro or anything like that, but I just realized that I was not headed in that direction, and I didn't really know where to go. And then in the beginning of 2021, last year, Trump said that he was going to try to, or not, I guess not, at the end of 2020, Trump said that he was going to try to scale back on the war in Afghanistan, and Biden, when he became president, said that he was going to do the same thing. And I realized after reading a really good article in Reason magazine that I didn't know much about the war in Afghanistan. You know, in 2001, like every American, I wanted blood, but in the 20 years that had taken place since then, I hadn't kept up with it. I didn't know what was going on. And so I was eating lunch at work, and I got on the computer and I just typed into Google. I was like, I would just really love to have like kind of like a libertarian perspective on the wars in the Middle East. And I typed that in, sent me right to Amazon to a book by a man named Scott Horton called Enough Already, which is kind of a summary of the United States wars in the Middle East since the 1970s. And again, wow, what an amazing book. Enough Already, if you're interested at all in foreign policy. Scott Horton is, I think, one of the libertarian movement's best kept secrets. He is absolutely great on a lot of these issues having to do with war and the state. And Enough Already is just an incredible history of how the government at every level has mismanaged the war on terror. But I remember I ordered it on Amazon and I had to wait a couple of days to find it. And so as I always do, I try to find, whenever I'm reading a new book, I get on iTunes and I try to find podcasts where either the author has been interviewed or where they do a review of the book so that I can start thinking about what the book is going to say before I read it. And I do this with almost every book that I read. And I came across this show called The Tom Woods Show. And for those of you guys that don't know Tom Woods, I didn't know who he was at the time. I'd never heard him. And I definitely judged the book by his cover. I looked at his picture on the cover of the podcast and was like, oh man, this is probably just some right-wing conservative who got lucky enough to interview a libertarian on foreign policy. But he had an entire week that he dedicated at the beginning of 2021 to Scott Horton and his book, Enough Already. So I think there were 5 episodes there. And again, I remember listening to them when I was working out in the morning and like, the first time that I heard Tom Woods and Scott Horton go back and forth, I realized like this is where I'm at. Like everything that Woods and Horton were saying. Again, Horton's an excellent historian, makes a lot of great points, brought in a lot of information about the wars I had no idea existed. And Tom Woods, just a very principled libertarian, not ashamed of his ideas, not ashamed of where he came from. And ever since then, I've never turned back. And again, it's only been about a year and a half. But because of Tom Woods, I kept on listening to the Tom Woods Show. I read more of Scott Horton's work. I started reading Ludwig von Mises. Tom Woods exposed me to Murray Rothbard and a bunch of other great Henry Hazlitt. I think Henry Hazlitt. Hazlitt is his last name. But a lot of great libertarian thinkers that I didn't even know existed. And so I started moving more and more down that libertarian road. And then just a couple of months ago, I started attending the Libertarian Party of Kenton County. One of the guys who's in the LP of Kenton County, he reached out to me because I decided to become a registered libertarian in, I think, 2019 or 2020. I realized that I was going to mostly vote for libertarians, and I wanted to join the party there. And so I joined the Libertarian Party and was reached out to by one of the guys who is in the party of Kenton County, and he just invited me to come to some of their events. And so once a month for the last couple of months, I've been going out I think the second Tuesday of every month, and we just get together at a bar and have some drinks, and we talk about libertarian politics, and it's awesome. It is just a ton of fun to hang out with guys that read the same books and listen to the same podcast as me, and that's how I became a full-blown libertarian. Now, there is a big connection for me between my Protestant beliefs and my libertarian beliefs. And again, I don't think that I would have been a libertarian had my Protestant beliefs not kind of prime me to accept the fact that I can't change other people's behavior, and it's not my responsibility to force other people to do things that I think that they should do. It's that idea that as a Christian, I can present the gospel to somebody, but they have to make their own decisions. And so I think that one of the things about being both an ideologically committed Protestant and a, kind of social / political libertarian is that we take ideas like that to their logical conclusion. So if you're going to believe that you don't have a right to force your values on somebody else, then that's true basically at all times and in all situations. Like I don't believe that I have the right to force somebody to do something they don't want to do, whether I'm sharing the gospel with them or talking about libertarian politics. Like I need to be articulate. I need to share my values and beliefs with them, but I can't force them to accept that, and I'm okay if they don't. Like, again, Jesus prepared me in Matthew 13 and everywhere else in the Gospels to just accept the fact that the world will not ever be fully Christian, and that is just the reality. So there's no pressure for me to try to force the world to be something that Jesus tells me that it will never be. And the same thing with libertarianism. It's that we want to create a space where people can be free, but there are always going to be people that aren't going to accept that. And so the idea is that we have to present our ideas in a responsible and articulate and intelligent way, and hope that other people will come back to that. And basically right now, when it comes to government, there are a lot of different ways that that people look at that. I'm essentially, to try to fuse this kind of Protestant idea with these libertarian ideas, I would consider myself to be a Lockean minarchist. And so when I say that, there are two terms. There are Lockean minarchists that we need to define very quickly as we wrap up the show here. But a Lockean is just somebody that accepts the philosophy of John Locke. I do think of all the Enlightenment writers on politics and political philosophy, John Locke got it right. The only reason why we need a government at all is to protect our rights to life, liberty, and property, those things that John Locke calls a natural right. And so that's the only reason that government should exist. God has given us rights. We're human beings that are created in his image and likeness. We all have a certain set of rights. Those rights include freely choosing God or freely choosing to disobey and be disobedient to God. Either way, we have to make that choice freely. And I think John Locke best sums it up, that that people have natural rights and the government should just be there to protect them. And so while I wouldn't necessarily consider myself an anarchist, I am a minarchist, which is a term that means somebody that thinks that you need just a little amount of rule from a government only to protect people's natural rights. Now, I will say that as time goes on, the min part of that minarchist gets smaller and smaller. Like, I really do think that the government shouldn't be doing hardly much at all, and I'm definitely within that kind of Mises, Hayek, Rothbard tradition, and I think there are a lot of people in the libertarian movement right now, Dave Smith, Michael Malice, Tom Woods, who I feel like they might consider themselves to be anarchists, and I'm pretty darn close to what they believe. But it's just that belief that in terms of government, we should only have a government that protects us, not a government that tries to force certain things upon us or take our money or anything like that. And the other thing that we're going to talk about from the Protestant perspective is what I'm going to call non-creedal biblicism. And this is the idea that if the Bible is the only source of authority as Protestants, then we shouldn't really accept any other outside sources of authority either. The Bible is the only legitimate source of authority. For me as a Christian, the Bible is the only legitimate source of authority that exists. That's the idea behind like radical Protestantism. It's the Bible and the Bible alone. There is nothing else that exercises any authority over my life except for God's authority mediated through the Scriptures. But you have to accept that authority without being forced to embrace it, and you have to allow it to change you instead of try to impose what you want on the text. And then we're going to talk about this a little bit in the next couple of weeks, that there are a lot of Christians that unfortunately read the Bible in a way that makes it seem like the Bible reinforces all of their previously held values. And so we're going to talk about this, and then we're also going to talk about how I think sometimes we focus in the church so much on like the traditional creeds of the church that it actually makes it hard for us to see what the Bible is in reality saying. And so we're going to talk about some of those things next week. But I do want to say, to wrap this up today, that I do think that libertarianism is the proper destination for Protestant Christians. If you believe in the authority of the Scripture, but that we have to positively present our gospel in a way that does not coerce or force somebody else to embrace it, that libertarianism is kind of the social and political extension of that. And again, it's really frustrating to me that like a lot of people that I went to like college with or that I grew up with that are no longer Christians or that are no longer practicing Christians, they either become hardcore conservatives or hardcore liberals. Like, people leave the Protestant movement and they become political, I think, because politics becomes a lot of people's God in the absence of a real God. And it's really sad to me that that people, they move out of a certain way of reading the Bible or thinking about the Bible and into these kind of political ideas that are inherently authoritarian. And one of the things that we'll talk about later on in a future episode is that there are a lot of Christians that kind of when they were in or a lot of ex-Christians that when they were in Christianity, they felt like they should impose their values and their beliefs on the world. And then when they leave their faith, they join up with political movements that also think that they should impose their values and their beliefs on the world. And I think that that's a really big problem. The great thing about libertarian philosophy is that it splits the difference. So if you want to be a conservative Protestant, I mean, I'm a very traditional Protestant, right? So my beliefs are based on the Bible. I'm very traditional. I accept the authority of the scriptures, and we'll talk about my values in future episodes. And I come down on the traditional side of a lot of issues that are happening between the church and society today. But the great thing about that as a libertarian is I can be a traditionalist, and I don't have to force other people out there in society to also be a traditionalist. And I'm not going to vote for politicians that are going to try to enforce my system of value and to try to enforce my systems of thought on the world. I don't want my values to be legislated, because if you're not a Christian, you shouldn't have to abide by my values. In the same way that I'm a Christian, and I wouldn't want somebody that's not a Christian imposing their values on me, forcing me to live out a life that I feel is contrary to my consciousness. And so for Protestants, libertarianism really does split the difference between all of these movements. You can be free to be whoever you want to be in the context of the local church without trying to impose through law, through force, through coercion, your views onto other people. And man, I think that's the best possible way for us to live in the world as Christians. It sidelines politics. It takes all of the pressure off of us trying to force our views on society, and it just allows us as Christians to get out there, share the gospel, and be the light to the world that Jesus wants us to be. Thank you guys so much for listening to this show. If you have any questions about my background, you can email me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. That would be really cool. Also, we've been doing this for a couple weeks now. Reviews on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to listen to are really helpful. If you could give me a couple of stars, 4 or 5 stars, that gives my show a little bit more notoriety. And then leave me a kind review. That just helps me get noticed out there. As of right now, I'm not on any social media accounts or anything like that. I am kind of anti-social media in a lot of ways because I've seen the harm that it does to society. If this show continues to pick up followers, I will kind of think about what I'm going to do next. And obviously, if you got any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But again, if you got anything for me, questions, comments, email me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to email you back. Next week, it's going to be great. We got part 1 of a 2-part show. We're going to be looking at the problem, or problems that can be caused by theological creeds from within Protestantism. And so this is the idea that if we believe that the Bible is the only source of authority, how do we deal with all of these creeds that every Christian in the Western tradition have kind of accepted since the earliest days of the church? And we're going to think about church traditions and biblical authority. So next week, we're going to kind of hang more on the Protestant side where we look at theological creeds. But the week after that will be part 2. We're going to take a look at socialism and Marxism in particular as political creeds that kind of do the same thing to the way that people understand the world as I think sometimes the creeds do within the Christian church. So this is definitely not going to be an episode that you're going to want to miss. I think that if you're listening to me, this might be challenging for you, and you might disagree with me, and that's cool. Next week is going to be one of those hard episodes that I hope you guys tune into. I hope you listen, and at the very least, if you don't agree with me, that's fine, but I hope it gets you thinking. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to the entire episode. It means a lot to me. I love that you guys are tuning into this, and I'm looking forward to carrying the conversation on with you guys next week. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to reach out to me about suggestions for future shows, you can contact me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. That's theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.